I would like to welcome Dr. Jeffrey Nall, who will be speaking us today about Reverend King's other dream, ending economic injustice.
The Reverend King that most of us honor each year fits neatly with the vision of a nation that has triumphantly overcome its immoral steps, making King's dream, the American dream, really a reality. Our nation's unjust past becomes further evidence of its greatness, since we generated not only the injustice, but we also managed to generate the solution to that injustice. It was a test of our greatness, and the good news is that we have passed with flying colors. Some indication of this we get from the conservative commentator Sean Hannity, who has described King as a great speaker and a visionary leader, praising his fight against segregation. Conservative commentator Bill O'Reilly has described him as one of the, quote, greatest men in American history. O'Reilly said that he admired that King was, quote, so calm, and his message was, look, what the Constitution says, equal rights to pursue happiness, equal rights to pursue the American dream. We want to be treated the way whites are treated, end quote. So figures like Hannity and O'Reilly are not alone in offering narrow, superficial praise of a man who was once hated by the same nation that now honors his birthday with a national holiday. Each year, elected officials, schools, and businesses pay lip service to King's commitment to service and justice, but without seriously exploring the depths of his ideas and his efforts. Many, and probably really most Americans who celebrate King do not really know him or his cause. The King we think we know is a self-serving fable of those with economic and political power, one that betrays the full vision of a just society that he struggled, that he died building. And it hollows out his most incisive social critiques. It dulls his prophetic philosophy of social transformation in the service of love. Again and again, my college students inform me that they are only taught that Reverend King was a civil rights leader who rather politely fought Southern segregation. We do not learn, they certainly do not learn, that Reverend King explicitly recommending, and these are his words, militant, though nonviolent tactics of social change, nor that he spent the last years of his life speaking out and organizing against what he believed was the immorality of capitalistic materialism and American militarism, as well as white supremacy. Now, to reiterate, Reverend King put militarism and capitalistic materialism in the same category as racism. Now, let's be honest. How many of, well, maybe a few people in this room, but I've been to a lot of different UUs. I've been in a lot of different environments. People call themselves progressive, people call themselves liberal, and there are not a lot of people who are willing to put militarism and capitalistic materialism in the same category as racism. And maybe we shouldn't. It's up for debate. King is not a god. He is a mere mortal with ideas. But if we're going to celebrate him, if we're going to honor him, the first way we can honor him is knowing what he said and what he was fighting for, what he was struggling for. Today we are called to confront the stark realities of economic injustice and the political polarization it cultivates. Political polarization does not come out of nowhere. It's not that people, as we say, are born racist, and they're not born with hatred in their hearts. What are the reasons? What are the causes? It's easy to condemn people. as deplorables, disposables, whatever their race, ethnicity, whatever their religion, whatever their gender. It's a lot harder to understand people, especially those with whom we have grievances with. To get ourselves out of this trouble we are in, we need to turn, I think, to the very ideas that got King into trouble. Ideas that challenge the common sense, that preserve the privilege of the powerful and the pain and inequities of ordinary people. We need to contemplate King's critical evaluation of militarism and capitalism. On April 4, 1967, exactly 1 year before his death, Reverend King delivered what was probably his boldest, at least well-known national address beyond Vietnam. And in that speech, King called on the United States to withdraw from Vietnam and to begin what he called a radical revolution of values by channeling the millions of dollars spent on war to address the dire needs of the poor. King contended that the giant triplets of racism, extreme materialism, and militarism reinforced one another, preventing the flourishing of a truly just society. Again, you don't have to agree, but he would argue that if you really object to racism, but you're failing to address capitalistic materialism and militarism, you're just joking. Reverend King came to this conclusion how? After observing that millions of black people remained in dire conditions, even as important advances had been made in the civil rights fight, including the ending of segregation, at least ostensibly, and expanding voting rights. Things, of course, now we want to fight back for. We want to claw back. And yet, even when they had been achieved, he said, we haven't solved the problem. As early as the bus boycott years, King had argued that those in power pit poor whites against ethnic minorities to prevent poor people from working collaboratively to change the social order. Now ask yourself, how many people in the public sphere today, in politics, in social media, online, are trying in good faith to unite poor people of all walks of life and bring them together to work collaboratively toward their common benefit? I think much more energy is being put into pitting people against each other, because that is how the status quo is maintained. And everybody can single out an instance of pitting people against each other they object to. But the challenging part, and we can go to Jesus for a little bit of this, about loving one's enemy, and the basis of that is not accepting one's enemy's bad behavior. It's about empathy. It's about knowledge. It's about understanding, which is genuinely, those aren't just moral niceties. Those are the ways in which we understand so that we can actually solve problems. Our existing centers of power and economic reward incentivize polarization, because solidarity is today and has always been a threat to concentrated power and privilege. Really, it's the only way that ordinary masses of people are ever going to experience dignity. King's awareness of the oppression experienced by poor whites was one of the reasons why he believed that using violence would be counterproductive to achieve racial equality. We have to do more than just talk about what we perceive to be the other side. We need to talk more about how there is a growing acceptance for the use of violence against those whom we deem to be fascists, that they have certain phobias we think we object to. There is a growing discourse within progressive circles that are talking comfortably about the use of violence. And then out of the other side of the mouth, paying lip service to Reverend King. It's not only the right that pays lip service at the expense of his fundamental values. King objected to violence because it was counterproductive and because he thought it was immoral. To use violence against many poor whites whom held really repugnant views that dehumanized other people. But why? Because they just woke up deciding to hate? Absolutely not. Because they themselves had been subjected to dehumanization from an unjust society. That's his perspective. I happen to agree with it. Perhaps you don't. We could debate. We can have dialogue. But if you want to honor King, again, honor him first and foremost by exploring and engaging with his ideas. visiting violence upon poor whites themselves subjected to economic injustice, he thought would only entrench the racial polarization which he was trying to address, which in turn helped maintain the economic class divisions, which did not help ordinary people. I mean, it was really good for a small number of people who do quite well. Reverend King understood, as we do today, that black people and other minorities disproportionately bear the burden of poverty. We know that's true, and we know there are plenty of ignorant folks who don't. According to the 2018 census, nearly 21% of black people and 18% of Hispanic people live in poverty, compared to 10% of whites, also 10% of Asians as well. Both relatively privileged, not just whites, also Asians. But still, 1 out of 10 ain't that great if you ask me. I don't think the solution is to get, well, if we just had black America, brown America, and Hispanic America, to 1 in 10, then we'd be good. I don't think that's acceptable. King didn't either. King also knew that everyone who was poor was oppressed. Whatever else was true about them. If they were poor, they were oppressed. Now, of course, this includes millions of poor whites. Our attention to the fact, and it is a fact, of racism, compounded by economic injustice, ought not make us ignorant or numb to the fact that there are 25 million poor white people in this country. As it happens to be a white majority nation, so it shouldn't be too surprising, 25 million poor white people. And there are also 12 million poor black people, and there are 16 more million poor Hispanic people. And each and every one of those poor people has a story that needs to be told, that needs to be heard, and needs to be understood. And if they could do it together, even better. Through his civil rights work, King continually came face to face with the dire conditions of the poor across the United States. And these experiences caused him to conclude that racial equality and the broader goal of human rights could not be achieved in the United States without a radical campaign against economic injustice. In December 1967, he said this: "In our society, it is murder psychologically to deprive a man of a job or an income. You are in substance saying to that man that he has no right to exist. You are in a real way depriving him of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, denying in his case the very creed of his society." And of course, he's referring to the Declaration of Independence. King believed that the United States could make good on this promise of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness by enacting a guaranteed livable minimum income for every American family, as well as ensuring that all workers, regardless of their industry, are paid a fair wage. He wasn't saying, as often reformers do, that, well, we really just need to make sure everybody's educated. We need to make sure that everybody has, a bachelor's degree, which I think is a wonderful idea as a college professor. And also because a college education is, and ought to be, significantly about self-knowledge, developing critical thinking capabilities that are vital to a democratic society. But the idea that I have students sitting in a classroom who are going to get a 10% increase in their wages to get a degree that has nothing to do with what they do in their workplace, that's a racket. That's unfair. People should be paid based on the wealth they're generating, not because they have a certificate from a college. But you'll find plenty of reformers who will tell you that the solution is more education. Sure, when education is required to do a job, but not as an excuse not to share the wealth that workers are producing. That's just a racket. King wrote in Where Do We Go From Here? "There is nothing but a lack of social vision to prevent us from paying an adequate wage to every American citizen, whether he be a hospital worker, laundry worker, maid, or day laborer. There is nothing except short-sightedness to prevent us from guaranteeing an annual minimum and livable income for every American family," end quote. So I think too few of those who celebrate King know that such an agenda was central to his moral, spiritual, political project. Neither do they know, and this may be one of the more important things for us to recall and maybe share with others, that the last few months of his life were spent attempting to organize a nonviolent poor people's, well, in his words, revolution, to advance this vision of economic justice. In 1967, King and his fellow organizers in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference began planning a Poor People's Campaign. And the intent was to bring together about 2,000 people, poor people, from all different ethnic, cultural walks of life, to set up an encampment in Washington, D.C., and then to pressure the federal government to commit to $12 billion to address systemic poverty. The plan was for the encampment to culminate in a new March on Washington. You know, the March on Washington gets a lot, again, that's what all the children learn about, it's what my children learn about in civics. But King thought that the March on Washington did not do the job because it was too narrowly focused. It needed to be focused, yes, on racism, but also the shared experience of economic oppression. During a 1967 planning meeting, this is what King said to his allies: "I think it's necessary for us to realize that we have moved from the era of civil rights to the era of human rights." What is he looking for? What is common to us? Racism begins with the claim that we are not one species. There's multiple biological beings who have different fundamental biological attributes. That is the foundational lie of racism. The recognition that we are all human beings with a beautiful spectrum of difference, but we are all that same species. That is part of that ecumenical humanism that King was after here. Just 2 months before the march, you probably know how this story goes, sadly, King was, 55 years ago, assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. And what was he doing at the time? He was speaking up on behalf of striking sanitation workers who were demanding increased wages and better working conditions. Members of SCLC followed through with that plan, though, of a March on Washington for poor people, with Coretta Scott King launching the campaign with a march through poor neighborhoods in Washington, D.C. on Mother's Day, May 12th. 9 days later, hundreds from across the country arrived to help create what they called Resurrection City, a self-sufficient encampment of about 3,000 people on the National Mall. It's also worth mentioning that on June 19th, 50,000 people came together, amassed in support of this effort, and marched to the Capitol demanding economic rights. And this, by the way, this 1968 Poor People's Campaign was a historic example of a multi-ethnic activism where people acknowledged differences, but they did not exaggerate them. They brought people together across ethnic, religious, spiritual backgrounds. The occupation lasted for 42 days before being dispersed by police. And I don't have to tell you where we stand today, all these years later, where Oxfam tells us that 44% of U.S. workers earn less than $15 an hour in 2021. More than half of black workers and 60% of Hispanic workers making under 15 bucks an hour. I mean, it just goes on. You know the statistics. We're encountering them all the time. The situation in Florida is even worse, actually. 50% of workers making less than $15 an hour. 36% were making less than $12 an hour. You know, how do people survive on these incomes? How do they pay for rent? How do they get housing? How can people earning $2,600 and $1,800 a month afford to pay housing when the average cost of rent, as I'm sure I don't need to tell you, ranges from something like $1,700, this is a few months back, $1,700 a month in Jacksonville to more than $2,000 in Tampa or Miami, Fort Lauderdale areas. And then by official poverty measures, a family of four earning $26,000 isn't poor. Family of four, 26 grand, they're not poor. And we know that that's absurd. By such accounting, just 12% of the population is poor and another 18% is near poor. But as we know, they're not realistic. So here's a realistic figure from Brandeis University just last year, which shows that 35% of full-time U.S. working families do not earn enough money, 35% do not earn enough money to cover basic costs of a family budget. This budget includes wild, extravagant expenses like housing, food, an occasional bit of medical care, some transportation, child care, and some basic household expenses. A quarter of full-time working families lack access to health insurance on top of it all. Being poor and near poor isn't a result of the laws of nature. It's the result of a bipartisan, political, economic set of policy choices. In April 2022, the Center for Economic and Policy Research concluded that the minimum wage would have been $23 an hour in 21 if it kept up with inflation and worker productivity. Instead, what happened to the additional profits that are generated by working people? They go into the bank accounts of the wealthy few, and they go into stock buybacks to enhance the value of the very stocks owned by those wealthy few. In 2021, the bottom 50% owned just 1.5% of all wealth, which is basically about the same as it was during King's last few years. The very poorest remain very poor. The very wealthiest earners now take more wealth, actually, from those just above the poorest Americans, whereas 1% of adults had about 25% of the wealth in 1960s. They now possess 35%. And the richest 10% of the population owned 71% of all wealth. So you won't be surprised, of course, to know that the global circumstances are even worse. So now, what I think King offers us here is a critical reflection on the economic state of affairs, because contrary to the dominant ideology, you don't really make money through work under capitalism. You make money through investment. It's just how it works. And most of the stocks in this country are held by very few hands. In 2021, wealthiest 10% of U.S. households own basically 90% of all of those stocks. According to Reverend King, we ought not allow ourselves to be deluded by the myth of capitalist ideology. He talked about capitalism. We shrink from it. Those in political power rarely speak of it, unless you're Bernie Sanders, right? Very few. In his defiant three evil speech, King cleverly observed that U.S. political policies favor these are his words, socialism for the rich and capitalism for the poor. You've heard that before. The mechanisms of government are disproportionately used to help those with power and wealth than those with the greatest need and those with the least power. King said this, "We have deluded ourselves," his words, into believing the myth that capitalism grew and prospered out of the Protestant ethic of hard work and sacrifice. The fact is that capitalism was built on the exploitation and suffering of black slaves and continues to thrive on the exploitation of the poor, both black and white. It's important to note we usually so focused on economic injustice, by the way, that we fail to realize this is not just about money in the bank. I mean, it is when you're struggling to survive. But what about this idea of freedom? What about autonomy? What about agency in the workplace? Somewhere I heard something about a revolution that was fought for freedom. And yet many of us spend the majority of our adult waking hours in a workplace that is run like an autocracy, where we are micromanaged. Are you going to the bathroom? Are you stealing company time? Have you talked to your friends a little too much? Are you socializing? Do you have any say over how the profits are spent? Do you have any say about the trajectory of the business? We've all just accepted that the answer to those questions is no, no, no. And most of us are just desperate to get paid enough of the profits we're generating so that we can actually eke out a decent living. I would say to you, to close, that attempting to solve the problem of poverty by exclusively teaching poor people to improve themselves is a lot of victim blaming. I think we've gotten wise to the victim blaming that goes against people of color, the victim blaming that goes against women, thanks to the Me Too movement and decades of feminist activism that helped generate that Me Too movement. We're not going to blame women for being sexually harassed because of their attire and so forth. We've started to learn how to identify. We've begun to be able to identify the structures and also the agents of that kind of oppression. Do we do the same, though, when it comes to poor people? There's a whole lot of nonprofits out there trying to help poor people what? Pinch their pennies? 100 pennies or a dollar bill, still not enough to get by. I don't know how many ways you slice and dice it. So attempting to solve the problem of poverty by exclusively teaching poor people how to improve themselves, get a better education, learn how to manage that modest few bucks that you have, not in the bank because you don't have enough money to put in the bank. Better manage their financial resources. This sort of paternalism, like telling what? Well, resources. This is a bit, I would say, and I'm going to be a little incendiary here, but I think telling poor people to improve themselves, to solve poverty, is a bit like teaching black boys and men to learn how to navigate white supremacy by not wearing hoodies or staying out of the wrong neighborhoods, or like trying to help women combat sexist harassment by encouraging them to watch what they wear. We all know that these kinds of suggestions fail to address the root of the problem and that they blame the victim. It's no less dehumanizing to tell a working person who is generating record-breaking profits. I don't care where they're working. They're flipping burgers, great, record-breaking profits. Starbucks, record-breaking profits. Amazon, to deal with their poverty by pinching their pennies. We urgently need to raise our voices against the presumption that poor people are the problem and to honestly acknowledge the fact economic systems shape many of the conditions that poor and near poor people are held captive to. We must challenge ourselves to develop the emotional, moral, and political maturity required of this historic moment. Democracies, as you know, are fragile projects that cannot persist without the virtues of civic humility, without compromise, without empathy, especially for those with whom we disagree with so much. Reverend King talked to his captors in a jail cell. He talked to white supremacists, and he was helping through dialogue facilitate the insight that you guys should be out there with us. You're broke, and all you've got to live on is a sense of your superiority because of your race. He didn't condemn them. He didn't say, of course he was in prison and they were cops, but at no point did King talk about these people in dehumanizing ways. He maintained a love ethic, which is revolutionary, radical, and I think something we might want to consider taking on ourselves, even as we call a spade a spade. And when we see something that's objectionable and we see an idea that we disagree with, we call it, but we learn to distinguish between the idea we find abhorrent and we refuse to accept and the human being who might be mistakenly advocating for that view, and ask the question, why would a person articulate and advance such an erroneous or deeply flawed ideology? These are the things I think the King truly leaves us to contemplate. Thank you.